everyone for coming. Thanks Estelle and Lisa. I'm really pleased that we can have as our guest speaker today Oliver Chanarin. Ollie, as Estelle mentioned, is one half of the artist team Adam Broomberg and Oliver Chanarin. Broomberg and Chanarin's works over the last decade have obsessively explored the role and currency of the documentary photograph. From early work which engages with the power structures of the photographer and sitter, to more recent work with archives and a curatorial debut with Alias in Krakow, where all the participants were not who they seemed to be, Adam and Ollie demonstrate a commitment to examining the photographic medium itself, offering a challenging, playful and strangely seductive take on the dilemmas facing documentary photography at the moment. Together they've exhibited extensively in the UK and internationally and produced many photographic books, including their most recent War Primer 2, published last week, based on Bertolt Brecht's War Primer, which I believe Ollie will present extracts of to you today, along with examples of some of their previous work. So please join me in welcoming Oliver Chanarin. Thank you.
Hi, can you all hear me? Because this microphone is attached to me. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. It's really lovely to see a full auditorium. And it's interesting that we're in a chemistry theatre, because photography is about chemistry and about material, although we don't think of that so much because of the digital revolution, but photography is about chemicals and pieces of plastic and silver molecules being deposited, and sometimes we forget the kind of magical history of photography. And actually, Adam and I have gone on this long journey in our work. We've been working together for 13 or 15 years, and we started off with this kind of, we started off very entranced with the magic of photography and a kind of naive, I suppose quite a naive belief in photography as this powerful medium that could do things, that could have social effect, that was political, that was obviously creative and a way of being expressive. And gradually through our practice, we became a little bit disheartened with that. We started to lose faith a little bit in the veracity of the photographic image, and I suppose it was a series of doubts that kind of crept into our practice over the years. When I was preparing for this lecture, Sarah mentioned that maybe it would be good to contextualize a little bit our work. So I've kind of gone back, I went to this folder I've got on my computer called Ancient History that I never look into, because it contains photographs that I don't like anymore, in a way. And I just want to give you a brief look at some of that older material. By the way, I think it's much nicer if you guys put your hands up and ask questions as we go, rather than at the end, because actually a conversation is more interesting to me than me sitting here and talking. I've also got a bit of a cold, so if you guys do some of the talking, it would be great. This is the first piece of work that Adam and I did. We did it. We didn't, although it's an image, it's two portraits, it's not a photograph, even though we are photographers and we think of ourselves as photographers. We started working together at a magazine called Colors. Colors was Benetton's magazine. I don't know if anybody's seen Colors magazine here. It's sort of, you don't really see it around anymore, but in the early 90s it was really, really popular. And it was Benetton. It was part of the whole Benetton campaign of looking at the world as one sort of global culture and looking at youth culture, which at that time was quite new. And you had things like MTV and this idea of the short attention span and like very short clips and juxtapositions of images. And this was all quite new. Now it all feels like a bit of old hat. But Colors was, when we were at college, Colors was something we all loved and we all wanted to work there. And Adam and I were lucky enough to get a job there. And they sent us to Tanzania, and we ended up in a refugee camp in the north of Tanzania called Lekole, which was a place that was home to 120,000 Hutu refugees. This was 7 years after the genocide. And we were doing what documentary photographers do, which is we were going around carrying our cameras, which were really heavy because we were using large format cameras, and we were taking portraits of people, and we were asking them questions about their lives, you know, like how was the genocide, and did any of your family die, and you know, where do you eat around here, and if your teeth are broken, where do you get them fixed, and there's no privacy here, where do you go and have sex, and you know, when you die, where do you get buried? Refugees camps are weird places because they're temporary, and these people had been living there for 7 years. And what interested us about this place was that there had been this moment, this kind of genocide, and the whole world had turned their cameras to this event, and photographers had descended on this place and taken thousands of, you know, pictures, and these pictures had been produced and distributed and sold and had become a kind of commodity. And these people were still there, but the photographers had moved on. Now they were in Sierra Leone or somewhere else. So we were really interested in this idea of the media coming and then going, and then what gets left behind. And so we spent some time. And this picture is interesting because, okay, you've got Hutus and Tutsis, and what we were trying to do was ask a question about representation. Does representation of a Hutu and a Tutsi, what we did was, I'll backtrack. We asked a sign painter who does the hairdressing salons, we asked him to paint us a Hutu and a Tutsi. And this is what he gave us. And this is the kind of, you know, cliche of a Hutu is got a wide neck and big lips, and a Tutsi is kind of more elegant and has a thin face and thin lips. And so, you know, the kind of the prejudice is inherent in the image, and what we were concerned about was how much our images, how much do images participate in discrimination? How much is representation a part of, how much was representation a part of what happened in Rwanda? How much of it was actually a cause of genocide? So that was some of the things that we were worrying about as photographers. And you know, we were concerned about photographs' inability to actually represent that thing. And this is another example. This is 5 years later, we went back to the same region, but we went to Rwanda, and at that time we had the chance to go back to some of the memorials that had been created to memorialize the genocide. And, you know, there was this whole industry about remembering the genocide, and there was 3 or 4 different memorial museums, and we were taken to this one school outside Kigali where a massacre had taken place, and a whole school full of kids and the teachers and all their parents, Tutsis, had been massacred. And as a form of remembrance, these bodies had been left where they'd fallen, and just lime powder had been put on them. And that lime powder had preserved the bodies of these dead bodies, and they were just lying everywhere. And we went and we took pictures of these things. And actually, if you go on the internet, you can see pictures of these things. Pictures by other people that had already taken them before we had got there. And in a way, looking at the scene felt less like a massacre, or less like a crime scene, and more like a kind of art installation. And we were quite bothered by that. It was like this memory had been packaged and contained and presented in this way that no longer actually felt very emotional. Yeah, if anyone else has got their phones on, it'd be great to turn them off. And then we were walking around Kigali, and we went past a photography studio, and what they were doing was taking pictures of entire classes of school for passport photographs. And the way that they did them there was they would put the kids up against the wall and take a picture, and then they would punch out their head and shoulders, and that was a passport photograph. And these were all the things they were throwing away, the remnants of that. And we collected hundreds of them, and we presented them in our book Fig. And in a way, for us, this sort of alluded to some of the horror and the history in a way that worked in a slightly different way to just a kind of straight representation of this memorial image. So yeah, one of the themes that you'll see emerging in our practice is a concern about the way photography engages with human suffering, and how it's possible even to represent suffering. And obviously, people are constantly trying to. We're constantly producing images of suffering. We're always seeing images from Afghanistan and Iraq and from wherever, war images. But how successful are they in capturing suffering? And what is the relationship between those pictures and the suffering? Again, a lot of our work deals with what's not in the picture, and this is a good example. We were doing a project in Israel a few years ago, 2006, and on the day that we arrived, it was, I think, the 14th of November 2006, a young Palestinian boy walked into a market in Tel Aviv and he detonated his suicide belt, killed himself and dozens of other people. And something that we didn't know was that very often at the site of a suicide attack or any sort of big explosion, the force of the explosion pushes the leaves off the trees. And you'll notice if you go to that area that the trees are empty of leaves. And it's quite a subtle thing, and in a way you could easily not see that. And so we collected this leaf and we photographed the leaf. And that leaf then became our photograph of that event. So again, it's trying to find a language in photography that speaks about a trauma that's so hard to actually show. And sometimes not showing it is more emotional or more effective. And on the same trip, we went to Ramallah. And it was the first time that Adam and I had been into the West Bank. We're both Jewish. We're both South African, actually, and it was quite, it was quite strange for us to be in Israel as Jews, and particularly as South Africans, because when you enter the West Bank, you enter a sort of apartheid state, and so much of the feeling of being in Ramallah reminded us both of growing up in Johannesburg and Cape Town, where you had this feeling that half an hour away in a car, there was something going on. And in the case of South Africa, Soweto was kind of on fire. But in the same way, in Israel, you have the sense that you can be on the beach in Tel Aviv, and it's fantastic, and Israel's an amazing place. And then just half an hour away, literally, you cross over into Gaza City or into the West Bank, and you're dealing with a completely different economic and cultural and political situation. Well, this was when Arafat was alive. And Arafat, for those of you who don't know, was the leader of the PLO. And he, at this time, was only a few months before he died, and I think this might have been one of the last official portraits of him. He was held up in his compound in Ramallah, and we were taken there and we met him, and we took this pretty ordinary photograph of him. And then on our way back through Israel, on our way back to England, the IDF had known that we'd gone to meet him, and they took our film. We were shooting on 5:4 film, negative film, and they took our film and they put it through their X-ray machine about 35 times, and tried, very intentionally to damage or destroy this piece of plastic. And that's what, coming back to what I was saying right at the beginning, we're sitting in a chemistry lab or chemistry theater, which I think is great, because photography is about chemistry, and it's about, in some ways, you can see the green thing across his chest there. That is the effects of the X-ray. And actually, I find that green strip much more interesting than the picture. And I think that green strip, the effect of the chemistry on that piece of plastic, says more about the Israeli occupation of the West Bank than the picture. So.
Were you like freaking out, asking them to stop, and they wouldn't, or?
Well, anybody who's been through Tel Aviv airports knows that you just can't.
Yeah,
you can't. Yeah, you can't freak out. I'm going to just skip through a couple of images now. And a few of them I'll just mention the backstory. These are pictures from our period as editors and photographers at Colors, and they fall into that category of images that I was talking about before, where there was very much this firm belief in the ability of photography to do things. So we were going to places like refugee camps, to psychiatric hospitals, to this is taken in a maximum security prison, and we were taking pictures of people, portraits, very dignified. We were trying to make the experience as collaborative as possible. We wanted the subject to be as involved in the process as we could, because we were aware that there was a fundamental danger with photography, an imbalance of power between the photographer and the subject. And we wanted to somehow fix that. We were going around the world trying to sort of fix this problem with photography, this imbalance of power. And so we thought that one way of doing that would be to talk to the people and to involve them in the process. And this was a guy called Dion, who was it's Posmore prison in Cape Town. And he was a pretty terrifying guy. He was the leader of one of the gangs that operated inside the prison, called the 28th. And what we learned when we got into this prison was that the whole prison was controlled by 3 gangs, and actually they controlled everything, even the wardens. And each of these 3 gangs had a very strict hierarchy that mirrored, strangely, the British Army. And at the top of this hierarchy was the general, and Dion was a general. And it's horrible to realize that in order to get up this hierarchy, what you had to do was you had to take the blood of a warden. So you didn't have to kill him, but you had to cut him in a way that his blood hit the floor. And so obviously all the wardens are walking around this place in complete terror. And the other very interesting thing is that as you go up this hierarchy, you're given a uniform to wear. And the uniform is invisible. It's an imaginary uniform. And again, it follows the uniform of the colonial British Army. So Dion was able to describe to us exactly what colour his shoes were, the embroidery on the buckle of his belt, what weapon he was holding, the embroidery on his cap, the insignias on his arm and the medals and what have you. And each person of every different rank was able to describe a different uniform. And we collected these descriptions. But interestingly, a photograph can't say that. A photograph can't do that. And it needs the words. It needs me to stand here and explain that to you. And that didn't bother us, because we already knew that photographs were pretty useless at a lot of things. And in a way, our work has become about how useless photography is. That's Dion's wife, Blondie, who was terrifying, and this place was lawless, and she smoked like 3 rocks of cracks before we took this picture. So I'm just going to go through. I mean, each of these photographs has a kind of story to tell.
Would you be able to say a bit more, because you just touched on it a little bit there, but how important captioning is to this? Because there's a lot of work here, but there's also a lot of work with you. Does that make sense in the way that the story comes across? Have you got an approach that sort of... Because I've seen your work with specific captions.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it also without as well.
I think nobody else can hear this question, but it's about the relationship between the picture and the caption. And sometimes our work has a caption, sometimes it doesn't. But always, I mean, you don't see photographs outside of words. They don't exist. Even in a museum where it's an empty room and it's one photograph on the wall, you always have the name of the artist and his biography and the date he was born and when he was going to die or when he had died. Or it's in a newspaper and there's a caption underneath. Photographs and words are always together. So I think it's naive for a photographer to think that they can't deal with words. You have to deal with words. It's like swimming without water. So that probably doesn't answer your question very well. And then here's just a few examples of things that people have sent us. This picture we took in Posmore Prison. And then somebody sent us this in the post. And, actually, no, that's a lie. We went to judge a prison art competition in Britain, in Belmore, one of the prisons here. And we walked in and there was this oil painting that was based on one of our photographs, which we immediately bought. But you can see that he removed the guy in the window, which is interesting. This is a depressed-looking cosmonaut from Russia. And he's depressed because he's never been to space. He's also depressed because he's sitting in a kind of 70s couch in a place that hasn't had any kind of real investment since the end of the Cold War. So it's not a good place to be a cosmonaut. There's lots of things to say, but if you look on his right arm, you can see there's a little rear view mirror strapped to his arm. That's for like when he's doing spacewalks, he can see behind him. And this is something somebody sent us in the post. Okay, there's lots of stories. These all have lots of stories. And I don't have time to go through all of them. But the last, one of the projects that we were most proud of in the series, it was 3 years editing Colors magazine, traveling around the world, looking at these stories. And just to explain, all of these projects were collected together in a book that we called Ghetto, because they each dealt with a different kind of ghettoized community. Some people were ghettoized by force, as in they were there because it was a prison and they were all stuck together. Some people by choice. We went to a very wealthy retirement village for American elderly people. Some of them, because of their mental state, were in a psychiatric hospital in Cuba. So this project was called Ghetto, and we put this picture on the cover of the book. This is a guy called Mario. And what we did was, part of this kind of idea of collaboration, we set up the lights and we gave each of the subjects a thing that they could squeeze in order to take the picture. And in this case, Mario turned his back on the camera and took the picture. And we just thought that was such a poetic act. And it alluded to a real understanding of images. We were really unclear whether any of these people, very naive in terms of their relationship to photography, some of them had never been photographed before, many of them, or all of them, highly medicated. And we didn't know what their reaction would be to the option of taking their picture. We just thought this was such a poetic act. He turned his back to the camera. And in fact, they all had different things that they were trying to communicate in these pictures. This is a guy called Juan, and we said, "Why are you screaming at the top of your voice?" And he said, "Because I'm just smiling." And he said, when you have your photograph taken, you smile. And so that's what he was doing. She said, "I've got to sit down because I'm an artist, and an artist always sits down when they're photographed." And this is like a classic reclining position, except she only had one arm. And then he was really amazing. I don't remember his name, but he said, "I need to take 2 pictures." And we said, "Okay." And he took this one and this one. And then he explained that this was the struggle in his life, between his head, what his head was telling him and what his heart was telling him. So, yeah, so that period of 3 years ended, and we kind of left because we were very exhausted from traveling around like this, dipping into places. And also, we had really lost faith in this equation of the documentary photograph as a form of as a political force, as something that was even any good at being a piece of evidence of anything. And that whole project, we were living in Italy, we came back to London and we started doing a whole lot of other work. And I don't know, was anybody here in the talk that Adam and I gave at Freeze a few days ago? I hope not. But yeah, one. Good, only one. Okay, well, in that talk, we admitted to lying a lot in our practice. And we tell a lot of lies, not to our audience, but to the people that we approach in order to get access to places. And we've told lots of lies, and we've made up lots of stories. And I really am not ashamed to say that. In 2005, we made up a story, and it was in order to get into a building that was Saddam Hussein's headquarters in Iraq, a place called the Red House. We had heard that in the basement of this building there was a series of solitary confinement cells, and we wanted to get in. And the story we made up was that we were working with a group of actors, Iraqi actors, who were rehearsing in the building, and we went into the building with them, and then that gave us access to this subterranean network of cells, which we then photographed. And all we did was we photographed the drawings on the walls. And it's a series of sketches and drawings made sometimes with pencil, often just scratched into the wall. And they allude to a kind of interior kind of psychological space that we at that moment felt it was interesting to present that, because this was at the height of the insurgency. It was, Iraq was like going crazy. It was incredibly dangerous to go there. And we went there and photographed little bits of wall, which seemed mad. but somehow we wanted to point to another way of somehow imaging this place. So I'll just show you a few of these. In fact, I'm going to... That doesn't mean you can go to sleep. Okay. And later we found out that this is a portrait of Saddam's daughter. And then you can see that there's layers of drawing. So there's somebody's done the drawing, then somebody's scratched out the eyes. And these really reminded us of, I don't know if anybody's seen Bresci made a series of photographs of graffiti during the Second World War. And if you look at them, they're the same. There's this kind of universal, what we call sort of war doodles, perhaps. Or that, I mean, that's the sort of thing I would do while I'm on the phone. But this is a place, this is a building with a kind of horrific history. You've got people being tortured in these chambers and kept in solitary confinement for months and months and months. So, and yet you've got these strange drawings that are sometimes maps of people's villages, strange iconography. And then we continued, I'm going to move on to the next project, we continued with our lies. We then started working in Israel. I spoke earlier about having gone to Israel and photographed Arafat, and the reason we were there was we were working on this project. It ended up being a book called Chicago. And Chicago, we found out, was this military training camp in the Negev Desert, which is that. It's hidden in there amongst those hills, and it's a full-size Arab village that was built to train Israeli soldiers to fight in urban warfare, and is a kind of laboratory for warfare, not just for Israel but for America as well, and for Britain, learning to fight in Arab villages. So we were really interested in this place, Chicago, because everything that had happened in this little sort of film set was a kind of it was kind of a rehearsal for everything that happened militarily in the area. So the invasion of Beirut in the 70s, and the first and the second Intifada, and the withdrawal from Gaza, and practices for the Battle of Fallujah, and even attempted assassinations of Saddam Hussein were rehearsed in this place. So it was this little microcosm of everything that had happened. And it also kind of stood like this monument as almost like a projection of a fantasy of an Israeli idea of an Arab town that was devoid of people, that was controlled, that was empty, essentially. This is something made by a soldier that we found in Chicago. It's obviously taken from some black exploitation poster and then blown up and stuck on. And this is one of the streets in Chicago, and you can see that there's even Arab graffiti put there by Israeli soldiers. And getting inside of Chicago took us about a year to get access, and we told the Israeli Defense Force that we were doing a sympathetic piece about the security problems facing Israel. And I think the fact that we were Jewish helped. And we even, they asked us, strangely, in exchange for this access, to teach a workshop to their photography unit, which is a propaganda instrument. So we gave a workshop. We had to critique the photography work, the photographs of propaganda photographers for the Israeli Defense Force, which was really difficult because we were trying to be really nice so they would let us in. This is fascinating. We noticed that on all the walls in Chicago there were these strange holes, star-shaped holes, and we discovered that they represented explosions. And what the Israeli Defense Force, they've developed these methods of urban warfare, which involve this technique called worming. And worming is a method of walking through walls. The Israeli Defense Force worked out that it was much more dangerous for their soldiers to walk in the streets and to enter buildings through the doors, because these doors were often booby-trapped. So what they do instead is move through the walls. And so you enter a building, and then you don't leave the building. So what they would do is they would use ultrasound technology, and still do use ultrasound technology, the same technology that you would use to look in a womb of a pregnant woman. So you would apply this machine to the wall, and you'd see through it, and you'd make sure there was no one on the other side, and then you would blow a hole through it and step through. And in this way you could walk through people's bedrooms, their living rooms, their kitchens, and their attics safely. And if you were to look from above, you could have an entire unit of the Israeli Defense Force walking through a small village and you wouldn't see anybody. So this was a representation of an explosion. It bears this kind of eerie resemblance to the Star of David. And like any sort of theatrical set or film set, there are props. And what these are is recreations of suicide bombs, lovingly recreated, in fact. There was the bomb disposal unit had a little museum of their creations, and they'd really been made very carefully. This is a guitar that was used by a Palestinian suicide bomber in Jerusalem. He walked into a pizzeria, killed himself and 17 other people. This was a bomb disguised as a watermelon that was left on a bus. This was a piece of rock, polystyrene, that was left on the side of the border between Israel and Lebanon. But I'll just go back to the guitar because it's got a little switch on it, which is really interesting. That switch is called a Deadman Switch, and they told us about that. The Deadman Switch is this device that was developed by the Palestinian bomb makers in response to an Israeli policy. Israel have a policy of shooting suspected bombers in the head. That immediately would disable anybody. But the Deadman Switch is designed to confound that. What it is you switch it one way to activate the bomb, and it's only when you let go of it that you detonate. And so in that case, it doesn't matter if you get killed or not. The bomb goes off anyway. And that's horrific, of course, but it alludes to this strange exchange of information and technology. They're almost like lethal gifts. You know, you have this policy, it results in the development of the switch, and then you have back and forth these technological evolutions. And what you have is two people that know each other so intimately. So that's the Deadman Switch. And I'm going to move on, actually, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. So continuing this narrative of lying, in 2008, Adam and I got ourselves embedded with the British Army, and we went to Afghanistan. And being embedded is this strange thing. It's this contradictory experience where the army agreed to take you as a journalist, and they agreed to show you the war, and they look after you, and they give you a place to sleep, and they feed you, and they're very nice to you, and they give you, jackets to wear, bulletproof jackets, and helmets, and in exchange you give them access to you. And that's the bargain, and it means that they can then control what you do and what you photograph and what you see and what you write about. And that system of embedding is relatively new. It started really with the First Gulf War, and it's become something that the British and the Americans developed as a way of controlling the way journalists moved around war zones. And the rules are very clear. You can't photograph dead people, and you can't photograph injured people, and you can't photograph the effects of any kind of ammunition on anything, including vehicles and buildings. You can't photograph in hospitals, and you basically can't photograph anything that's a sign of war. So it's sort of pointless going at all. And that's not to say that there aren't brave journalists that do go to war unilaterally. There are. But they're the exception, and they're very, very vulnerable. And a great example of that, or a terrible example, is Tim Hetherington, the very extraordinary photojournalist who died in Libya a few months ago. So we wanted to somehow push back against this idea of the embedding system, because we were concerned that despite the abundance of cameras in the world, there was still this very sanitized idea of war. And one of the ideas that we put forward in our talk at Freeze last week was, and maybe this is wrong or maybe this is right, but it's the idea that actually the state is less threatened by the journalist because the journalist is controlled by the system of embedding. For the state, the journalist is kind of an innocuous figure. And perhaps the artist is a much more threatening figure. And the artist, we were worried about telling them that we were artists because we knew it would make them nervous. And so we didn't, and we lied to them again. And we told them we were journalists, and we didn't, because they wouldn't let us take the pictures we wanted to take, we decided we won't take any pictures. And instead of a camera, we took a box of paper that contained 50 meters of photographic paper. It was light-proof, and each day when we were called to a scene that you would normally photograph as a journalist in a war zone, we instead would unroll a sheet of 6 meters of paper, expose it to the light for 20 seconds, and put it back in the box. We didn't know what these would look like, and this one was taken on the second day that we were in Afghanistan, and it was the day that the 100th British soldier was killed. So we called this photograph the day of the 100th Dead. And so we made a series of exposures of this nature over a period of 12 days, and each one was titled with the event that it was supposedly representing. And I'll show you, first of all, sorry, whoops. Okay, I'm going to show you a little bit of a film that we made that this film follows the box on its journey from our studio to the war zone and back, and it's a bit like a sort of comedy or a kind of Dadaesque stunt where the only thing that we're interested in is the box. So the camera is almost attached to the box by a piece of invisible elastic, and it goes on this journey to and from. I'm not going to show you the whole thing, but you'll get the idea. And this work, we always show this film alongside the exposures because, in a way, the exposures deny this view of war, and this one shows the banality of war. So here we go. Here's a little bit of this. Control F, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump ahead a little bit because it's a very slow film. Here we've got to Dubai. I'm going to stop it there, but that's the beginning of a series of adventures the box goes on. It gets taken into a jeep, then it gets carried into a tank, and then it goes onto a helicopter and then an aeroplane. Eventually it ends up in Helmand province and then gets taken to a forward operating base, to the front line, where these exposures take place. And we don't carry it. What happened very naturally and quite oddly is that the soldiers that were chaperoning us around immediately saw this box as a piece of our luggage and just started carrying it. And they become these kind of unwitting actors in this strange narrative, carrying the thing around. And of course, this is very subversive. You're asking soldiers who are fighting a war to carry around a cardboard box. And eventually the army were not very impressed with us, and they realized that we were not taking any pictures, and they sent us home. So, how do I get out of that? So to go back to this, I go view a slideshow, right? Okay. So here we see the results. They were displayed. This is one of their exhibitions that we've had. This work has pretty much been exhibited since we made it, because it was seen as very provocative towards the photojournalistic community. Although we were not saying that photojournalists shouldn't be out there taking pictures of war, and we were not saying that people who were suffering shouldn't have their suffering documented, because we do believe ultimately in the importance of recording these atrocities. We don't, we're not nihilistic in that sense. But this was seen as quite as aggressive towards the photojournalistic community, and because of that, it's been on tour a lot. It's been shown a lot. There's been a number of shows that are questioning photography. Anti-photography was one of them. There was one called Anti-Photojournalism in Barcelona. There's a show there's a show called Seeing is Believing in Berlin at the moment at KW, and another one called The Familiar Uncanny also in Berlin at the CO Berlin Institute. There have been all these shows that are questioning photography, because I think war zones are full of these different kinds of witnesses. You've got soldiers, you've got journalists, you've got artists, you've got civilians, you've got unmanned drones. All of these things have cameras attached to them. And yet, despite this abundance of images, we still don't really see what wars really look like. And here I'll show you these are details of some of the roles that we exposed. And I think, what we wanted to try and evoke for the viewer was a question. And the question is, what do you expect to see? What do you want me to bring back? I'm going to go to this war zone. I'm going to take some pictures. What do you want to see? What would be a good enough representation of this conflict? Wow. We are totally running out of time.
How about the colouring? Is that all natural colouring?
The colouring, this one's blue, but the light leaks into the paper and it exposes onto it, and we don't manipulate that at all. So where it's black, it means there was a lot of light, and where it's white, it means that there was no light. And in between that, you have these arrays of colour. It's almost like a trace of a moment where we're recording the temperature of the light at that moment. And in a way, that's the essence of any photograph. It's just the record of a moment, in a sense. We kind of imagined that we were like those explorers that would go up to the North Pole and drill into the ice and bring out a little wedge of ice that would have been on the surface in medieval times, and you could measure the oxygen in there, and you could say, well, it was a sunny day in the year 1400 or whatever. So we saw these as sort of like traces in that way.
Do you think, in a way, that because I saw the show at Paradise Row, and what I liked about the video was the fact that you kind of couldn't see any of the images, and in a way, the roll of film was actually very aesthetically pleasing. So, in a way, it's kind of aesthetic. Do you think it's aestheticizing the? Yeah,
well, any photo
in a different way.
In a different way.
Imagery,
Yeah, it is in a different way, but any image is aestheticizing something. So it's something you can't escape from. I mean, we've had that. That's a really interesting question. The question, for if you couldn't hear it, is why is this so beautiful, right? In a way, okay. You know, look, I don't find that beautiful, but some people might, and people have said, "Ooh, they're really pretty. They almost look like modernists."
But it could be done in a shopping centre.
It could be done in a shopping centre, and they could have been done on the roof of this building. Yeah, but you know, these. When you go and see these works, each one is a unique thing. It's actually, it went there and it came back, and it got cooked by the heat, and that heat affected the way that the image was produced. And there are scratches and marks present on the surface of the images that wouldn't be there if you had done it on the roof of this building. And it's been quite interesting because we've had shows in museums where we've had panicky phone calls from curators who've kind of brought in the restorers with a paintbrush and a brush and said, there's a disaster, there's a scratch on this, there's a mark, there's a lump on, a bit of mud on it, and we're like, just leave it. That's part of the work. Because the impression of the journey is inherent in the object.
I was going to say, it's interesting to me that banal, the way the video is so banal, because to some extent, like I say, it could have been anywhere, but you're going to a war zone, and I suppose to then label it as that makes this beauty also similarly quite evocative.
Mm.
Yeah.
Do you exhibit the video with photographs?
We do, yeah. And that's quite important because, as I was saying earlier, the photographs deny a view and the film shows the banality, but neither fall into the trap of the spectacle. Each one is titled with the event that it's documenting. This one's called The Repatriation. It was taken on the day, or we were there when they took the coffin of the 100th British soldier and put him in the plane and repatriated him to the UK.
Will you have a contextual text, or do you choose to avoid them having a contextual text?
Are you talking about in the case of this project?
Yeah.
We had a context.
A lot of the pieces,
In a lot of the pieces, really depends. In this case, we did have a contextual piece, and in a way, a text, but also the video sort of contextualized it. It sort of explained. So once we'd explained what the video was, and we explained about the box, and yeah, we did explain in this case what we had done. You know, and
prefer that, or is it?
I always feel we feel torn about it because on the one hand you want to explain there's something generous about saying this is what we did and this is what happened. On the other hand, it makes it quite banal and turns it into a sort of school project. And there's something. Sometimes it's nice to expect people to do a bit of work, you know.
I don't think I agree. I think that the way you explain this is taking at the time of the 100th soldiers' repatriation doesn't make it banal. I think it could have. Yeah, I think the process was probably very banal, and the way that it was taken.
Yeah.
But I think that your captioning of it doesn't make it banal.
No, I agree with that, but I think the question was about a contextualizing text, like in the gallery or in a book. But yeah, I agree with that. Sorry.
How do you feel about the fact that there isn't a text and actually it's a story that you tell verbally that actually becomes the content almost?
Well, there is a text.
The work.
Sorry?
That you telling the story is part, it seems to be part of the content of the work, not just the visual material.
That's right, I think that's right. And sometimes you have that story in the book or the gallery or the presentation of the work, and sometimes that information comes out slowly, like I tell you here, and it gets recorded, and then some curator reads about it in a magazine, and the story of the work has a life of its own, and it goes on a journey. And I think we started off in our careers, we started off with a real anxiety about what you're talking about, a real worry that the narrative, if the narrative got disconnected from the image, that there was some danger of it being misrepresented. And actually, I think we're really excited by that danger and the problems that come when you disconnect those things and you make it more difficult, and it becomes, a piece of work goes out and it goes on a journey and it's more ambiguous. The problem, sorry.
I'm wondering if you're kind of playing with myth and that kind of, telling a story and it being passed on, and how that's recorded.
Yeah, I think that is interesting, the life of a work once it goes out. I don't think we're trying to create myths.
No, but a myth is, what I believe in a myth is someone tells a story and then at some point that is recorded. So it's therefore never accurate because it's always passed on to something else. So, as you say, it has its life of its own.
But the more you lock down the meaning of something by contextualizing it with a text, in a way, the less interesting it becomes. So we do contextualize our work, but we try to do it in a way that leaves some things open and some things in question. And sometimes you ask yourself, is this real or not? Do I believe this guy? And actually, I know he's got a history of lying, so maybe I shouldn't. Can I show you? I'm going to skip through a whole lot of stuff because there's no time. But I am going to show you very briefly, and you may have seen this show that was at Paradise Row.
And there's a show at Paradise Row now.
There's a show at Paradise Row now, and that's what I'm going to show you. This is a whole other project that I'm not going to tell you about now because there's no time. But this is our new book. It has some very strange images. Okay, very quickly, Adam and I were asked to curate a photography festival in Krakow, and our proposal to them, we were reading the work of Fernando Pessoa at the time. If anyone has read the Book of Disquiet, they'll know that Pessoa was a strange guy who invented all these fictional personas and wrote poetry and literary criticism and novels under the names of all these alternative people. And we decided that we would, in our festival, we would not have any real artists, but that we would only show the work of fictional artists. And in order to do this, we invited writers to invent fictional artists. And they gave them a name and a biography, and they said a little bit about what they were interested in, what their concerns were. We then took those texts and we gave them to artists, and we said, we don't want you to be you anymore, we want you to be this person. And some people said, I'm not interested in that because I've spent years building up my identity as an artist and I believe in it, so fuck off. Other people were like, God, I'm so sick of being myself, thank you. And they embraced it wholeheartedly and bravely. And one of the projects, there were 20, so this was the text that we had at the beginning. It says, none of the artists in this exhibition exist. All of the works are copies. Can you read that? Is that legible? Alias is an incomplete survey of invented artists. It includes the works created by fictional others, spurious institutions, anonymous collectives, and artists who have decided to inhabit an alternative version of themselves. And when we started this process of commissioning, we discovered that actually through the ages, artists have always invented alternative egos or alternative personalities. And so one aspect of this show was a kind of historical survey of the alias in contemporary art. And then there was a series of these commissions. I'm not going to go into that. So this is the story of an artist called Dorothy Burt. She lived in the Warsaw Ghetto. She was Jewish. She was the youngest daughter of a family that ran a photography studio called the Burt Photography Studio. This was the studio that was commissioned by the Council of Jews to document the ghetto as it was being liquidated in 1942. And Dora, as the youngest daughter, was part of this photographic community. She, very secretly, started to photograph her friends in the studio at night, and it was a sort of August Sander type attempt to record her friends and her friends' mothers at this moment that the whole ghetto was being liquidated. And rather strikingly, all these portraits are nude. The narrative is really interesting. Dora she eventually was sent to Treblinka where she perished. But prior to that, she produced this body of work. At that time, it was very hard to get access to photographic materials. And by the time she was printing these pictures, she was able to develop the images, but she was not able to fix them. And so they were forever unstable. And they were kept in a dark box for many years. And they were shown for the first time in Krakow just in May this year. Because of their instability, they can only be seen behind red glass. Otherwise, they get destroyed by the light. And I'll just show you the series. They're actually paper negatives. They were shown in Krakow during this Alias festival that we curated.
How did you find them?
I mean, your response is totally normal, and so many people have that response. Really, and the reason that we all have that response is because we believe in stories. And although I started off this thing by saying, this is a fiction, this is a story about an invented person, by the end of it, everyone says that. It's not a strange thing to do. And everyone says, but hold on a second, is this real or not real? And why is that? I don't know. I think because it sounds plausible, and perhaps because they're presented as authentic documents. And it's been very interesting. The show opened last week, and a number of people... We got a phone call from the Times newspaper, the picture editor, to say, well, it was an email to say, I was really moved by those pictures, and thank you for bringing them to me, to us. Thank you for revealing this. They're so touching. So this particular project, Adam and I produced these images. But in Krakow, we didn't tell anybody who made them. Yeah. And in the show here in London, we still don't really say. We just say that we're presenting them, and that these are the work of Dorothy Burt. So,
Why did you decide on you?
actually, the content of the images is driven by the text that we were given by the writer. Right. And the story, the narrative of the text was really, I mean, that's a really important question. The reason they're nudes is that during the Third Reich, during this period, the Nazi mindset, there was an idea about feminine beauty. There was Aryan beauty, which was very much a classicist idea of the Aryan woman. She was naturally beautiful. She didn't need makeup. She didn't need jewelry. She didn't need fancy clothes. She was genetically beautiful. In contrast to that was the Jewish woman, who was known as the adorned Jewess. And the adorned Jewess was bohemian. She was decadent. She wore a lot of makeup and perfume and this is the cliche. And while during the Third Reich, Jewish women were seen as objects, and in Auschwitz they were referred to as pieces, not people, they were at the same time eroticized. And so there was this dichotomy between the eroticized adorned Jewess and the classically beautiful, naturally beautiful Aryan woman. And in the text that we were given, Dorothy Burt is subconsciously, or consciously, we don't know, trying to fight back against this idea of the adorned Jewess. It's a sort of celebration of Jewish natural beauty. And that's the narrative of the story that we were inhabiting. And I wish there was more time to go into the production of these pictures, because that's also quite interesting. But I think we've run out of time, I'm very sad to say. And this is what they look like in the show. Is there time for any questions? Or is that it?
Couple of questions, please.
I was going to ask about the photographs which you just exposed. About, do you ever get criticised about your morality towards those real events? Because I know that Picasso, for example, talks about when he was going to things? Is it really true? It's so much, possibly it's a lot more far removed from the body of the editor than the event itself. And when you choose that territory, kind of making paintings almost, or kind of feel abstractions or something like that. Do you feel that, or do you think it's kind of a truer, truer representation?
I think they look like paintings, they look like kind of Rothkos or whatever. And that's a pity in a way, because that's, I think, a bit of a distraction. I think our question is more like, how much information do you need in the picture for it to be a piece of evidence, actually? And, you know, we cite as a good example of that, there was a famous award-winning photograph of Bhutto's assassination. And it was taken by this photojournalist. He was 10 meters from the explosion, and the picture is blurred. And actually, you can't see anything in it. And actually, that was the genesis of this project, because we looked at this picture and we said, this is completely abstract, yet it's presented as a document. And so how much information does a photograph need to contain in order to be a document? Any other question at the back there?
Are you going to reveal the identities of the artists that made the work in the Hague?
Well, in the catalogue, we do reveal who participated at the back on the inside flap, upside down. But we don't say who did what.
I was interested in the parts where on the 6-meter exposures were pieces of mud, scratches, and you referred to them as parts of the work. And I wonder in how much they are photographic in a sense as well, the pieces of mud. How do you see that? Or something else?
Well, they're just aberrations on the surface of the photograph. But I think the point I was trying to make is that they're not photographs in the sense that it's from a negative that can be reprinted, but it's a unique object.
I understand. I think what I mean is good in the sense of how things could be a proof of something that happened in some kind of way. For example, a footprint where you be a photograph as well. Does it need this photographic procedure?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, no, what you're talking about is representation. And there's many ways of representing something, through a photograph or through a sculpture or a print. Or I was just, the reference to the mud and the scratches, they're a little bit like that X-ray mark on the picture of Arafat. They're part of the picture, and in a way they say more than the picture. Anyone else?
Do you still have the same moral drive as when you believe that pictures are citizen?
That's a nice question, because I feel quite excited at the moment about photography. Like, we've started shooting more black and white and printing it ourselves. And we've set up a darkroom in our studio, and we're starting to engage with the actual practice of photography again. And that's just happened very naturally. We've gone on this journey of believing in photography and then kind of questioning it as a form of representation, and find ourselves kind of coming back to a sort of just love of it, a love of the process and of the materials. And but I don't know where that's going to go. But yeah.
When you use the word photography, at which point do you think it becomes art?
That's a hard.
You know,
Yeah.
there's a kind of,
You know what? Okay, I can't answer that question, but for me, it happened when I stopped taking pictures and when I started worrying about pictures. That's when it became art. Because, like in this project here, these fictional characters of these nude women, the pictures are not art. But what is art is the conversation. When somebody goes into the gallery, or when the picture editor of the Times calls me and says, I was very moved by these pictures, we want to run them, and I say, well, I've got to tell you something about them, they're fictional. And then she doesn't know what to do with her feelings that she had, and then she suddenly feels incredibly angry, and, you know, that's the art. There's the art. So, I think there are good times to lie and bad times to lie. And I think I don't feel worried about lying to the Israeli army. I don't have any regret about that.
And then more positively, like, can lying be...
Lying can be very positive force in all of our lives, yes.
Sorry, when you were talking about when you were in the Israeli army and the soldiers you felt when you were giving this photography course and you felt that it was propaganda. I'm Israeli, so for me it's interesting to understand what you were saying. It sounds like as if it's very one-sided.
No, it's more simple than that. You have a photographic unit in the IDF. Those are young people who are soldiers and they're interested in photography. They've been tasked with the job of going to the north, going to the south, going to the east, going to the west, and taking pictures of Israel that are positive and are celebratory, and that can be then disseminated to the outside world as a positive image of Israel. That is propaganda.
Okay, on that explosive note, I'll have to stop it there. But
I've got one request.
Yes, yeah. Ollie has one request, and then
we have to stop. One request is Adam and I are hand making a book called The War Primer 2 that I didn't have time to present today, but we have to make 100 of these, and we're looking for volunteers to help us make them next week and the week after that. So if anybody feels like coming to our studio and sitting, and it's quite a manual task, but it's a great project to be involved in. If anybody has the time and the inclination, come down at the end and give me your emails so that we can arrange for you to come. We can do it outside, yeah.
And I'm sure everyone else wants to agree as well. Thanks so much for your generosity today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.